So welcome, folks. This is the final panel of the day, and the goal of this panel is to kind of share some reflections, certainly on what we've talked about over the last couple of days, and also to kind of dream up some next steps. I know a few of you folks have asked about the Social Innovation Coalition and how to get involved, and the truth of the matter is we're still trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure out some of the goals of the coalition, and we're certainly trying to shape them around what some of the great work that government's doing, where some of the gaps are with what government is doing, and where the community kind of needs to be supportive and work together. So I'm joined by a superstar panel here who are both in person and virtual. Hi, Chels. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to just maybe start with a quick 2 minutes from each of our panelists on just a quick introduction and your role within the social procurement ecosystem. And so I'll actually start with David down to the far end.
So hi, I'm David LePage, and I work with Buy Social Canada. And Buy Social Canada is a social enterprise that when we started it, we realized that we really needed to consciously try to push the social procurement initiatives across Canada. I had worked for a number of years working with enterprising nonprofits and other programs that were really developing social enterprise and developing the supply side of a social value marketplace. But we realized that we couldn't really grow a market unless we had the demand side of the market. So we tried it in 2003 and realized no one knew what we were talking about, and we weren't real sure what we were talking about either. So that didn't work so well. But once we figured it out, we really consciously set about wanting to shift the activity in the existing marketplace to move it from just economic transactions to actually starting to use the marketplace to create community value. And that meant our business plan was pretty simple. The first 3 to 5 years, 80 to 90% of our work was missionary work, is what we referred to it, was find some way to do some consulting, to do some other work in order to get the funds to allow us to just start to talk about, start to explore tools, start the learning. And so our whole purpose is, it's so great to see the discussion over the last couple of days, because it's exactly what's going on here in St. John's and in Newfoundland and Labrador. Is you're building a new marketplace. And I've had the great opportunity and honor to come every few years and see that progress. And I look and hear the discussion of this last panel, and it's amazing the progress that the community here is driving in terms of building an ecosystem that really supports the social value marketplace.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Cooper. I'm Professor of Strategy at the Faculty of Business Administration. I'm going to use a whole lot of former things I am. So I'm the former interim director of the MBA in Social Enterprise and Entrepreneurship. I'm the former chair of Smart Ice. I hired Carol Ann. That's my best. Yeah, there you go. 5 years this week, right? So there you go. I former chair and the founding chair, I guess. I wasn't the founding director, but the founding chair of Smart Ice. I'm the former chair of Food First Newfoundland Labrador, with Carol Ann is now the current chair. You see the connection here? I'm an advisor and a consultant to a lot of social enterprise organizations, specifically currently I would say a lot of the community business development corporations across the province. And then secondly, in my past, a lot of Indigenous organizations where really I got my start as an academic and as a researcher and as an advisor. In terms of social procurement, I'm also part of the coalition, at least up until a couple weeks ago, but now that my role is over, I'm not sure I'm there anymore. Anyway, we're still trying to sort out all our governance and all those sort of things as well. I think social procurement is vital for the future of Newfoundland and Labrador. I think it's vital for Atlantic Canada, and it's vital for especially rural parts of the province. The only way that we can really develop social procurement, and I'm sorry I've not been here for most of the conference except for this afternoon, is to really develop the business case. And that's what we were able to do at Smart Ice. That was what we've been able to do at Food First. That's what we'll be able to do at Guided the Good. Sorry, Kim, didn't want to forget you. But all those other organizations that are out there, that really what the business case and what the proposition is, because that's how you, not only, as one of my MBA students was writing me the other day, not only being competitive, but also being cooperative in terms of establishing what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to do. And so very excited to be part of the panel. Thank you.
You forgot one thing,
What?
the other connection.
Yoga?
Yes.
Yeah, Caroline also teaches me yoga. So there you go. And also I have MBA students working with end homelessness in Newfoundland and Labrador right now. We're working on a project with another social enterprise here that's, I think, is confidential. So, and yeah, so I just know a lot of people.
Kind of a big deal.
Kind of a big deal.
Newfoundland famous. And Labrador, of course. Always got to remember Labrador here.
Famous. He's famous. My name is Caroline Harding. I'm the CEO of Smart Ice, Tom's yoga teacher, and chair of Food First, and also a director on the board of PINWA. And PINWA, you could look that up. It's PINNGUAQ, another social enterprise that's focused on the north that we partner with. As part of the ecosystem here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we're about 5 years old. I think we're making waves, although you can't see the waves because the ice is over the water, so the waves are underneath. And with climate change, the waves are melting the ice in record speed, 3 times faster in the Arctic than anywhere else in the world. So it's warming. So as part of the ecosystem that sort of sits in St. John's, our constituents, shall we say, are actually in the north, in Canada's north, which is from Nunatsiavut, Inuvialuit, Nunavut, and hopefully soon to be Nunavik. I feel that we're trying to do our best to walk the walk, which is a really important thing, and I really love how it was brought up earlier about how we're trying to set an example for other businesses and other community organizations. And I'm really proud of that, and I'm proud of the fact that I have a lot of friends in this room and that we talk freely and openly, trying to solve problems. And, you know, we like the bigger tent and we want you all in it. And that's the difference between talking not to social enterprises and other social purpose organizations. We all want to hold hands and do yoga together. Okay.
And I've only ever had one yoga class with you, Caroline, I think, but I have had one, so I feel like that connection still applies.
David, have you ever done yoga with Carolina?
No, but,
No.
but I may be back.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, hey, that was all I'm going to say. So I'm Josh. I'm the CEO at Food First NL. So we are a local nonprofit organization with a provincial mandate around food security. So we are looking for a province where everyone all the time has access to affordable, healthy, culturally appropriate food. And that's actually a pretty big mandate when you think through what needs to be true for that to happen. We've been on the ground for about 20 years now, 22. I've been in the role for 2 of those years, 2.5 now. And so where we sit in the ecosystem is in a couple places, actually. We are a network organization for folks working in food. And so one of the things that we end up doing is we hear a lot about what that ecosystem looks like and where the gaps are in it. And I think that's a specific role to play as a network organization there. We are also a buyer. And I'm still adapting my own head to think about this, but since COVID, we've kind of out of necessity created more of an on-the-ground presence for our organization than in sort of frontline work than we used to. So we spend $750,000 a year on direct like purchasing of, not of food so much, but of gift cards, of delivery services, and related things through that program. And so we're including meals from the Hungry Heart that are a big part of our frontline work. And so one of the things I'm actually reflecting on here is that we haven't always been thinking with intention about that whole budget in terms of how that sits. And then we're a seller, so we have 2 social enterprises ourselves. One was a pilot in 2021, paused this year and relaunching next year on the West Coast in partnership we did with Choices, called the Western Food Hub, and that was around connecting local buyers with local products more seamlessly. I'm not going to give you a ton of detail, it'll take forever. And then here, just last month, we launched Food on the Move. So Sarah Crocker is here in the back. Food on the Move was out there at the Social Enterprise Fair, and it is a mobile food market here in St. John's focused on bringing affordable food close to people who need it. So we are now on that side of the ecosystem as well. So we're trying to think about it from a bunch of different angles. And I think just building on Tom's point, I'll shut up in a second, but I think it is worth also saying especially in a province this small, we all sit in the ecosystems as organizations, but we also sit in the ecosystem as individual people, right? We have a lot of interconnections and relationships. I used to work at the Community Sector Council, then at Choices. I did some contract work for Inspiring Communities in Nova Scotia, doing kind of ground level, ground truthing around social innovation and social enterprise in the province for a year or so. And most people who are involved in this sector have done something like that. Taken a contract outside of their main job, or been involved as a volunteer or in a leadership capacity with another organization.
Josh, farmers market for you as well.
Yeah, farmers market too, right? So I used to chair the board of the St. John's, thank you. I used to chair the board of the St. John's Farmers Market when it was transitioning into the space that it is now. And so I think one of the, it's not always a good thing in our ecosystem, but it's an important, it is often is, and it's an important thing to name, is that there is that kind of deep interconnection. Any panel like this that you draw out of the kind of social innovation ecosystem, everyone has taken different roles at different levels with each other all the time.
Great. Yeah, thanks, folks. And last but certainly not least, Chelsea, to introduce yourself and your role within the ecosystem.
Hi, folks. Nice to see all of you from Ottawa this morning or this afternoon. My name is Chelsea McNeil. I'm the president of Common Good Solutions, a social purpose organization in Atlantic Canada that helps support social impact development across Canada. And but I'm fairly new to the role, I will say. I've been with Common Good Solutions for only 3 months, and it's been an exciting thing getting into across communities across Atlantic Canada to really kind of like dive into what social purpose organizations really need in order to thrive in the context of the conditions for success, social procurement being one of them. In a past life, I was a director of education, employment, and social enterprise at Choices for Youth for 7 years. And at that time, built the social enterprises, Impact Construction, Neighborhood, The Shop, as well as Crust. And over that 7 years, we were really working very hard to build opportunities for young people, build social enterprises that could create really good training opportunities for young people, and as well create exponential impact in communities. And so how my work really shows up in social procurement was really, I think, started at the very beginning of my tenure with Choices for Youth, when we were looking at what opportunities were available for impact construction to really do the great work that it sets out to do, which is to train and support young people so that they can move into the competitive trades environment or into education and have that hands-on work experience. So we saw a mechanism by which we could achieve those outcomes was through the advent of social procurement. So I believe it was in 2017, we hosted the first social procurement summit actually down at the Alt. I think it was the first event the Alt ever had because it was just built. And David, our colleague, David LePage was there, our colleagues from Common Good Solutions in Nova Scotia, as well as folks from Winnipeg, folks from Ottawa, kind of descended upon St. John's to talk about social procurement and how we could really create social procurement policy in which social enterprises can really thrive by opening up market access through the mechanisms of procurement. Future forward, it's really fun for me to be here with you all on this panel, especially all the colleagues on the panel, because I really feel like we are at a critical juncture in this social procurement conversation. 6 years later, we're talking about it, but we're talking about it in a very different way, and we're talking about it with an energy, and not talking about why it's so important, but reminding ourselves why we've been perhaps doing this advocacy over the last number of years. Moreover, what does it look like to implement? And I have to say, probably a career highlight for me was seeing the sustainable procurement work in action. And yeah, I'm really just so happy to be here and feel so grateful for everybody's continued commitment to social procurement and what it could potentially unlock for the province.
Awesome. Thanks. And thanks, Chels, for being here, despite also being in Ottawa. So this is great. There's so much going on this week, so we're so appreciative of everyone making the time for this. So there's really one major question that we're going to dig into with this panel, and that's that, throughout the past few days, we have heard about so many goals when it comes to social procurement. What is it that we want social procurement to look like, and what do we want to kind of achieve collectively? So we've talked about the need to build a culture around social procurement, that the strategy is important, but the culture is more important. And so how do we embed that within government, within the private sector, and within the way that we do work? We talked about the need to tell compelling stories. Yes, have the indicators, yes, evaluate, but also tell the really compelling stories that resonate with government, resonate with the private sector, and really tell the story of our impact. Collaborate so that we can best scale. I think it was Josh who talked about aggregation and, how is it that we might collectively go to, tender together in some cases, but I think in other cases it's really about that more informal collaboration. How do we bring others along through this process? So, we have the coalition, but how do we build that out? How do we work together from an advocacy perspective? How do we ensure accessibility is reflected at every stage of the procurement process, and making sure that social procurement is accessible right from the tender process? And how do we help define best value and help our colleagues with government and the private sector see what best value can look like in action? And I think, again, this is part of that the past few days, but there's certainly more that we can do. So those are just high level, some of the goals that we've talked about over the last few days. And so my question for the group is, what are we missing? Are there any other goals that we want to kind of really hone in on from a social procurement perspective in Newfoundland and Labrador, because we have that opportunity to craft it as a province? And how would we work to address these goals from a systems perspective? So what are some of your ideas for how we can drive this forward and think about next steps? So that's a big one question, which is actually secretly three questions. But maybe I can start with you, Tom, because I think you're the freshest perspective to this conversation here this afternoon, and so you didn't have the benefit of listening to everything. But I would love your thoughts on this.
I actually had to cancel a class to be here as well. And it's
We
right.
appreciate it.
Yeah, Aaron, that's one of my bosses. Aaron, I canceled the class to be here.
So why didn't you bring the students to this class?
They're undergraduates, they ain't coming to anything. Sorry,
Hey,
post-COVID, post-COVID, right? My MBA students, but they got all their marks, so they don't need to worry about it. But I'm not sure. One of the big things that we've always, in the business, regular procurement is around scale. Right? So if you're a supermarket and you say, hey, I want to go to a local producer, say I'm a Costco or I'm a Coleman's or a Sobeys, if you can't show up and deliver when I asked you to do, then you're useless to me, right? Because it's not just, they want to buy local, a lot of them, but they need to have scale. They need to be able to deliver quality, quantity, all their terms, all that sort of thing. And a lot of times, the only way to get that is through scale. And so one of the issues that we have in Newfoundland and Labrador is just like just like I say, oh, I know everyone. We know everyone, and because we're small, right? And there isn't that. So that ability to compete against the private sector really means that there needs to be an element of coopetition, or however you say. So there's an element of both cooperating together and also competing together to make sure that we can meet the needs of scale, we can meet the needs of a government, we can meet the needs of the private sector when it comes to procurement, because they don't want to take on the risk, because they're going to say, hey, we're trying to do a good thing, we're trying to help the sector, et cetera, but the absolute users of that, whether they're sitting in a daycare or whether they're sitting in some other or any of the potential, whether they're using ice maps or whether they're using food or they need housing, all that sort of thing. It's all nice and good, as in the Innu once said to me, is, you're happy people. That doesn't mean you're realistic people. So it's always really important to think about what are the realistically can we deliver. And I think one of the only ways to do that is through scale. Sorry, I'm not sure if you've talked about that. Maybe somebody had a
No.
2-hour conversation on scales. So there you go.
And Tom, just to I just want to kind of zone in a little bit more on that. So thinking about how we scale, because I think there's lots of folks in this room who are perhaps operating social enterprises or interested in starting to enter the social enterprise space. And I think this is always one of the challenges, is thinking about, well, where is your market? And then at what time, at what point do you actually scale, and how do you scale? So thinking about your point around both cooperation and competition, how might social enterprises think about, how to scale?
I think at the beginning it has to be about networking and partnerships. I think it has to be about understanding what you're really good at and what your business case is and what you're not good at and where you add value. That takes strategy, that takes sometimes patience, and that also takes focus. And a lot of people in the social enterprise, not-for-profit sector are so passionate, so brilliant, so energetic, but sometimes so unfocused, because you want to change the word. I'm looking at you, John Butler. But that's no problem. That's a compliment at the same time. But that notion of making sure that you can be really focused on delivering. And before I got involved in this world, I've been involved in the corporate social responsibility world for about 20, 25 years. When I lived in London, we were talking about this, and they were talking about sustainability and big corporations. They all want to try and do the right thing. Everybody wants to do the right thing, but it's all about delivering. And I think, Jen, the practical elements is about, being able to sign agreements, being able to scale, being able to access capital is an enormous one. And I'm not sure how much that's come up in the last number of days. But when I look at the indigenous band-owned organizations that I've dealt with, their ability to access and raise capital has been a really critical success factor in being able to compete. So if you look what the success stories that come out of Nunatsiavut, the success stories that you see in Nunavut is a lot of times is access to capital. And if you have a not-for-profit organization, unlike traditional, sorry, I'm telling you to shut up whenever, but traditional, if Caroline and I went into business tomorrow and we said, hey, we're willing to co-sign a loan, or we're willing to put a personal guarantee on stuff, that's great. If I'm in a not-profit organization, there's no way I'm signing a personal guarantee. There's no way I'm taking that risk. In the private sector, because I will benefit from it, I will take a calculated risk to see if that's going to work for me. And so therefore that access to capital, as we've seen in a lot of studies, and David, maybe you can allude to it, has been more of a challenge for social enterprises. We were even talking about just at the break in terms of, and also some of the banking organizations culturally don't really understand social enterprises as well. So I think so partnerships, being able to deliver, being focused on what you do, and then finally being able to access capital, I think are all practical things that if you're going to advance the social procurement agenda, then you're going to be able to do it. So a company like Seafair Capital can do all that because you're in the private sector. If you're in a social enterprise that's a little bit more, narrowly focused, you may not be able to do any of those things. So that's where the challenge I think you get into. Thank you.
I think it's safe to say that Tom did not cancel class.
Did I feel like I was lecturing?
No, it was very good.
I was going to talk about ecosystem theory and why, like institutional theory and why this all applies. But no, I didn't. I stopped.
You held back, yeah. Thank you, Tom. Does anyone want to build off of what Tom said?
I was going to say
Yep.
something really similar, but I do have like a couple of additional things. I think when we're thinking about scale and thinking about the ecosystem in Newfoundland and Labrador, we also maybe have to think about the ecosystem outside of this province, that there are places where scale is not feasible within our provincial boundaries, right? So like our shop, for example, we're about to get to 20 employees. That actually makes us fairly large for a Newfoundland and Labrador nonprofit. Choices and Stella's accepted. There's not very many big ones. There's some hard limits on what our organizations within the context of this province can scale to meet. And so the other dimension of this is thinking about who are the folks doing similar work. For me, I think the obvious low-hanging fruit here is strengthening our relationships across the Atlantic provinces. That there are opportunities for cooperation, for alliance, maybe for scaling together in some version to meet some of these things. Like if you're in a sector where you need to get to having 50 people working on the thing, but it's not feasible to have more than 20 working on the thing in Newfoundland and Labrador, well, you can find the other 30 somewhere else, right? And so I do think we're seeing that certainly in the food world, but in lots of other places, that there is more and more conversation happening and more recognition of kind of common ground of our contexts between, particularly around the Atlantic provinces, where there is a lot of common, I think, social attitudes around what social value looks like. Polling is pretty consistent in terms of people's attitudes on key social issues in a way that's not across the country. So there's a space, I think, I think scaling our local ecosystem might mean scaling outside of it sometimes.
Yeah, that's great. And I know like one of the things that we talk about a lot at Choices for Youth is around partnership first. So it's not necessarily that we need to show up somewhere. It's that a service, a support, a business needs to show up somewhere. So how can we support others in making that possible? Other parts of the province, across the Atlantic region, I think there's some major opportunities there. Chelsea, I noticed that your hand was raised. So I'll go to you next, particularly around how do we drive forward these goals related to social procurement? How do we drive them forward?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think so. The best way I can, we always know what we don't want, probably often better than what we do want. I always think of a haircut. Like when I get a haircut, I can tell the hairdresser, no, I don't want this. I don't want to look like this. So in this case with policy, I feel like I can say what we don't want to happen. And I think what we don't want to happen is for policy to be created and not have the capacity to realize the opportunity. And so when I think about building out the demand side of this relationship, I think it is so critical to also think about the capacity side and what's required to build the capacity of social purpose organizations in the ecosystem. What kinds of, and as Tom mentioned, capital being a critical component of it, but also and partnerships, but also what do we need in terms of building these business models, of building, scaling out, scaling up, scaling deep, all of these things really matter. And so we as an ecosystem really need to make sure that we get our house in order, where we make sure we coordinate and build so that when the policies come through, we can realize the opportunity of the policies, because if we don't do that work, the policies are going to come in place and then folks are going to say, well, we told you so, there's not enough, see, we tried it, it didn't work. And that is the worst case scenario. So part of getting our houses in order as an ecosystem is really advocating for that capacity building, advocating for that and seeking out partnerships to build and grow and scale. Those things are really critical. So that's what we don't want. It's interesting. So coming from the nonprofit social enterprise space over the last number of years, and now kind of moving into this new role with Common Good Solutions, and really seeing that the complexity of the problems in which we're facing are going to need an all hands on deck approach. And so in Atlantic Canada, we're seeing like the development of SPOs, you know, across the spectrum of different types of businesses. And I think it's really important for us to be really okay with the fact that, you know, us as social enterprise, we're not going to do it all. We're not going to be able to solve all the problems. What we can do is coordinate a really deep an inclusive ecosystem that can support movement towards social impact goals. And like that includes the for-profit sector, that includes the nonprofit and charitable sector, that includes, you know, all the folks kind of rallying and championing towards, you know, greater social impact. And social procurement being a mechanism to unlock that is really, really, really critical. And it's interesting in a rural context, Roseanne's comments last night with the CBDCs really resonated with me around, you know, like having impact in your community through the mechanism of which is business or, you know, commerce, is something that rural communities are like, have been doing and do and will do, and will have those impacts, you know, every single day all across Newfoundland and Labrador. And so I think it's just really important just to recognize that this is big, broad, and we have to work really hard on our end of the bargain to make sure that we're ready for these policies.
Thanks, Chels. And I think that that's a really important point. We haven't talked a ton about capacity from a social enterprise perspective. We've talked a lot about, you know, how do we tell our story and changing the culture around social procurement and what we want the policy to look like. But I think, you know, kind of what is our role as SPOs in this is a really critical point. Tom, I know you wanted to jump in there, and then I'll go to Carol Ann.
Yeah, and actually ties into capacity. I was listening to a presentation from another organization on Friday, or I was with another organization on Friday from the Conference Board of Canada. And if you ever look at the numbers for Newfoundland and Labrador, especially when we get around 2030, we essentially fall off a cliff when it comes to people retiring, and all the baby boomers at that point have basically exited the market and stuff like that because they retired. And moreover, we have an aging workforce. Capacity, or people capacity, is such an important element. Smart Ice would not be where it is without Carol Ann. Food First would not be where it is without Josh. Choices would not be where it is without Jen and Chelsea, and now Chelsea's left, et cetera. But that's one of the great things that we have in the Faculty of Business Administration, is that I think we've recognized the need for that capacity through our MBA in social enterprise and entrepreneurship. We've recognized that need through our regular MBA, where we have MBA students working with social enterprises and trying to apply those elements from there as well. But people capacity is going to be so important, and making sure that we have the skills, and also, you know, making sure that we work really well with the private sector and not think of the private sector as eat the rich and, you know, as a negative sort of thing as well. The private sector is awesome. The private sector is, I think, really wants to do the right thing. And if anything, it kind of goes to my question from the earlier session. It's like we need to also embrace other actors in this ecosystem, specifically the union movement, to make sure that they come on board with what we need to do around social procurement. And so that partnership, that collaboration becomes super important, but we need the people. Thank you, and I'll shut up for the rest of this.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, and Carolyn, over to you. You know, just thinking again about like the goals of the last few days. How do we drive them forward? What are the next steps?
Oh, there's so much stuff going on in my head here. But I keep going back to what we hear in Indigenous communities, because we work predominantly in Indigenous communities. And when I first started at Smart Ice, I had never been to an Indigenous community before. And time again, I hear, not for us, without us. And I think maybe that's what Chelsea was getting at when she was talking about, you know, a policy being created that, you know, it has to be for us, with us, right? It can't just be created for us without us. So that's sort of one thought. But I went into that listening and learning and humbly approaching every conversation and knowing I didn't know anything, and very just lay it out there. I'm here to learn and to listen and to listen. And I think there's a lot of that sort of philosophy that we all do with each other, and we have that really good respect. So I think with that basic respect that I've learned a lot from the Indigenous folks that we work with, I think is a lesson learned to go forward. But I'm going to put my board hat on. And I think that's a really important piece of this, is that if you all have boards, there's an opportunity here for tone at the top, at the board level. And if the board members of an organization, and you might have 8 or 9 or 12 or, unwieldy at 20, it's, if you have the board members that believe in this, they all also work other places and probably are on other boards. I mean, I don't know, but I'd say most people that are on a board are on another board and another board. I'm on 3. And it's quite common. So if you can get that tone at the top, understand the environmental, social, and governance, the ESG and the EDI piece of it, then I think that's where you set that tone of how the organization then works. You hire then for value alignment, complete value alignment. And when you get the tone at the top, you hire for the value alignment so everything is lining up, then I think it's an easier journey, and it's not a push. I always say it's not Indiana Jones trying to stop that ball from coming at him, right? Because that's what it feels like if you just drop a champion in somewhere and hire somebody for 6 months to say, all right, you're going to do this now and make this happen in 6 months. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, but you don't have that at the board level that says this is important to us, or that it's not in the framework. It's not important to us. So social procurement, value procurement, however we want to call it, cannot happen by one person in an organization alone. It has to be a tone at the top, and it has to line up with everybody's value, including the employees and all those advocates on the board that you have. So that's kind of my little board soapbox. But I personally think it's an important point.
And that's that piece around, like, there's a strategy, but there's also, like, how do you foster that culture, right across your agency and inclusive of the board as well. David, yes, over to you.
I'm going to agree and disagree. So to me, scale is a nice thing sometimes, but sometimes small steps are really necessary. And scale to me is maybe aggregating impact. But when I look at what we're talking about, it's probably a 5 to 10 year goal. And I think there's so many pieces in place, and all the stuff, you talk about how we do it, I totally agree. It's like focus. I always say and if you want to get there, it's going to be patience, and it's going to be persistence, and it's going to be patience and persistence, and when a little window opens, jump in it. But I try to look at things like we have a lot of pieces that go into where we're trying to get. And I think what's really the biggest challenge is to figure out what the cover of the puzzle box looks like. Because we often, like in our sector and in this, when we're doing paradigm shifts like social procurement and social enterprise, we know what we're trying to do. We don't quite have a picture of the top of the puzzle box. And we've got all these pieces, right? So we say, oh, we need social finance. Oh, those guys are sitting back there in secret finance, seafair finance. And you've got all these social enterprises, and we have got public policy people here. We had private sector people. We have all these pieces that all need to play a role. But we need to be really capable of trying to define what's the role they play to help create what we want to have in a number of years, right? So when we engage, we have something we're focused on. We're not just focused for focus. We're like going, no, I'm focused here because if I can engage the labor at this way, and they might not be ready to scale right now, but maybe they're willing to come to a discussion. And so I think we need to look at some things that can be really quick and big wins and great stories, but also realize that this is a long game. And sometimes it is like that rock is coming. I always use it the other way, Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. And sometimes it's that way, and we have to face that. It doesn't always happen overnight, and if we take that long view, that like we're running a marathon, we really, I think, have such a great opportunity to do that inclusive discussion, because not everyone's ready to do social procurement. It's like an oxymoron for some people. And we're moving, though. So how do we engage them in that effort? So as we scale, the scale, as you've mentioned, is really not anyone necessarily scaling, but it's the aggregate of what everyone is doing to create the scale of impact.
Certainly setting the realistic expectations, I think, is really important. Because if you talk to some people, they want you there tomorrow. And then there's other people that don't have a clue about it. So there's a sort of a happy medium, right? A little bit of push
And
pull.
creating that framework that, like Tom was talking about, the business model, like, and how does everyone fit in? So when you can bring someone in, they say, oh, this is the value I get out of this. And then collectively, oftentimes, people don't even know they're playing a part. But if you have a really good definition of what that future looks like, you can engage, and that's where the leadership, in my mind, comes in, is engaging even the resistant. There's an editorial came out in Financial Post earlier this week trashing social procurement. It is the illiberal effort of the Trudeau government to destroy capitalism, And I'm like, is that a good thing that people are talking about social procurement at all in a major thing? And then someone else on social media today is copying it and saying the same thing. So we're going to run into resistance. We're going to run into opportunities. We need to understand what we're trying to achieve. And that's what I think is so important. The comments about focus, it really is so critical.
Yeah, I love the concept of like the capacity to scale together. Doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to scale, but it's that we need to scale collectively in order to kind of meet the needs around social procurement. Chelsea, I see that you're, sorry.
I'm just going to use Tom's grocery store
Yeah.
model. The only reason they're successful is they aggregate all the grocery store things you need.
right.
They don't just sell ketchup or lettuce. And so when we think about that idea of the big store, why do they work well? Because they're good aggregators of serving a community need.
Yeah, great example. Chelsea, I want to go to you. I see your hand is or was raised, so over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to I totally agree with what everyone's saying. I also think there is something about this that is demanding better of our policy environment. So in a lot of this work that we've done over the last number of years, the thing keeps coming at the table that is this is the right thing to do, well, which is kind of subjective, I suppose, but this is also a logical thing to do. This is a thing social procurement can offer solutions to multiple pain points. If the construction company is having a labor problem, then subcontracting impact construction can support that labor problem, but at the same time supporting those better on job sites so that there's a pipeline directly to the union. There's so many reasons why this all makes sense. But one of the things that keeps me kind of awake, I suppose, around this topic is the burden. I think of the burdens of opportunity, but even more than that we need to demand doing more for our citizens with money, with the use of money. There's nothing innovative about money itself. Money's money. It's buying things is buying things. How we use money can be where the pockets of innovation really exist. And so on one hand, the marathon is very much being run, the steps towards progress, the development, and we've all been very wonderful and cordial, and we've supported the development of this concept into where we are right now, which is really kind of in the throes of analysis in the policy framework. But I'm wondering, can we be bold? Can we just demand more as citizens, as individuals, that when we're making decisions, when governments are making decisions, when institutions like Memorial, like Eastern Health, when we're making decisions in which to spend money, that shouldn't there be a responsibility for generating the most value for the communities in which you serve and you are in? Shouldn't that always be the goal? And do we need, especially in the advent of economic change, I think about like the developments in Stephenville, I think about the developments, hydrogen developments in Marystown. Should we be demanding more investment and different kinds of investment in communities when things are affecting the communities in which we work in? And shouldn't those resources go to those who live within the walls of those communities in which we're either like supporting or extracting from? And so when I think about opportunity, I do like sometimes get a little like, I want it to move faster. And David, I totally hear you, like the marathon, but I see what's possible. Like I see what we can do. Like when we did a case study with a $500,000 job we did with Newfoundland Labrador Housing. And I think Aon worked with me on this with Choices for Youth. And you know, when we look at like the money you're going to spend anyway was $500,000 for a job done, we were able to generate so much return in like social, and from a social perspective, for the money they were going to spend anyway. Were we able to like reinvest the money they spent with us? We were reinvested right back into young people in their salaries that they were able to take back to their homes, and then young people going on to post-secondary and changing a trajectory of someone's life. Shouldn't we always demand that of our the institutions who spend money? Shouldn't that be the thing that really sort of fuels this, is the why? And isn't there a responsibility to spend like that? And that's where like I get less gentle and more like that I impatient, and maybe I shouldn't be impatient, but I'm only impatient because it makes sense. I'm only impatient because the numbers make sense. I'm only impatient because I think that if we're extracting from community, we have to figure out how to have those communities at the center of what's possible, not only looking at the economic reverberations and the economic potential of a select few.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Chelsea. I think that's a really great way to wrap up this particular question. And I think a good reflection for all of us on what is our individual responsibility and our collective responsibility to generate social value as governments and as individuals. So I guess in our last few minutes together, folks, I would just love any kind of final short thoughts on next steps. So, you know, we've had some great discussions over the last few days about the vision for social procurement, what we know it can generate if we're able to kind of unlock social value within government and private purchasing and individual purchasing. But in terms of tangible next steps for us as members of the coalition and others who perhaps are interested in this movement and already a part of this movement, I'd love to hear any kind of quick thoughts from this panel.
It's a verb. Social enterprise, social procurement, social finance are all verbs. They are tools. They are not an end. You wanted it quick.
That's great. That is quick. Appreciate it.
I think it'll happen organically eventually. The problem with organic development, it takes a long period of time. And ultimately, one of the great things about working at the university, you get some access to really good databases. And sorry, I'm a geek, but one of our databases is called Euromonitor, and they identify a whole bunch of big megatrends that are happening around the world. And some of those megatrends are lined up perfectly with social procurement, like circular economy, premiumization, a whole bunch of other ones. And they look at big macro trends that occur over 20 years, 30 years period of time. If we need to do something in the short term, then it needs to be more proactive. Whether it's, as Chelsea was saying, but to me that goes back to kind of the world of industrial benefit agreements and community benefit agreements and making sure that those are pushed and are not a burden, but instead it's a goal and you should be demonstrating that. But the final point is, for me at least, is social procurement is aligned to when you can report on your impact. You can report on the great things that you're doing, whether you're in the private sector, public sector, the not-for-profit sector. Let's hold organizations accountable for their social procurement. Let's look at that and educate people like my kids who are 11 and 14, who I won't see because I'm not here. Sorry, people making fun of me for not being here. But, but ultimately, those kind of questions, they get that. They'll decide to make decisions around what to buy and what not to buy. And the only way to do that is be able to be transparent in your reporting about the social impact and what you're being able to achieve. Thank you.
I think with Smart Ice, where I can affect any of this is to continue to set an example. And we have an international stage and a national stage and a provincial stage. And it's to get out there and to share the narrative and share good things that social enterprises can do. So to always be that model in the community to do that. Do you know that I've never had a funder ask me for any social impact data? It's me delivering the social impact data to the funder. Nobody has ever asked me for anything. But I can tell them that we've created 15,000 hours of employment in Nain that has 7 employers. So if I take that as as something that I have to do because I want to do it for everybody, is that setting that example and pushing that out there so that it becomes the narrative that people then start asking the questions and understanding why we're doing what we're doing. I think that's my contribution to that I can continue on that national, international, and provincial stage. And one of these days, the funders are going to say, what are your social impacts? One of these days. But luckily, I push it to them because I spent 11 years in public service asking for people for briefing information. So now I'm killing them with kindness and giving them all the briefing information. And that's why the minister can show up on my door in 24 hours, because they're completely briefed already. So I think it's, upon us all that are in this sector to get that message out there.
Thanks, Caroline.
Just segueing maybe off of that point around getting the message out, I think one of the things that I see in the near future, and that's really important, is broadening the group of folks who are participating in this conversation. And I think sorting through the kind of alphabet soup that we're having over today is important. I did a bunch of rural engagement around social innovation. No one knew what the hell I was talking about. Like, no one uses social innovation language for most of what they're doing in town or outside of it, right? Like, that's a bubble of thinking describing something that lots of people are doing. And same with SPO, and there's a lot of, I think one of the challenges is like, there's a lot of social impact happening that's not being captured by social impact language or people who are not identifying. And then there are people who are claiming social impact that probably shouldn't be, right? That are using the language of social impact to obfuscate, right? So I think like one of the journeys that we're going to be on over the next little while is figuring out who's in and who's out. And I don't mean a hard boundary, but there are certainly folks, I think there are some folks in this room, but there are folks who have for-profit business models who absolutely should be in these conversations. There are folks who have non-for-profit business models who might not be in these conversations, right? Like I think we have some sorting to do is one thought that I'm left with. And I think what can we do as a kind of a network of folks who are in this conversation to open that door? So if you're doing something interesting in your community that has a social impact, that you know where to go with that and where to grow that and who to connect with, where you might not feel like you're part of any of the boxes that have been presented to you. I think that's one thing I think a lot about. The other thing I was thinking is Chelsea was talking about kind of the best possible policy environment. I don't like to argue with you, Chelsea, but I actually think I don't want to wait for the policy environment to be perfect. I think there is a risk here when we're in this conversation of piling expectations. I'm staring right at Heather Tizard right now. Like, there's a risk of piling expectations on what you're doing, for example, or on any of the other, like on the feds, on their policy statements. I think like the best that we can get is great. But there's always going to be workarounds. There's always going to be places where the policy is insufficient and someone else is going to have to take a risk or figure something out. And I think just like preparing ourselves for that and not waiting for the policy environment to be perfectly enabling, because that can be, you can be stuck in that wait, right? And so that's a fine balance we're all treading. Like, I'm really glad to see the movements we're seeing in the policy space, because it was way too restrictive before. It's not going to be perfect after. It will be better, but there will still be places where it's not going to necessarily work the way we'd like it to, and we need to think about solving for that.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And Chelsea, finally over to you for any kind of final thoughts or reflections on where we go from here.
Cool, thanks. And Josh, you weren't fighting with me at all. We're totally in agreement on that one. Roughly right, I think, is the language that I think the developmental evaluation folks use. I think the last piece, that I would leave you with, I think it's critical to put community first. Community at the center of the engagement, community at the center of the decisions, and community squarely, and the benefits of community squarely in the why we're doing it. We need to anchor back to that all the time. Why are we operating these social enterprises? Why are we trying to create and transform, I think, the business environment to be more socially conscious? It all comes back to the folks in which we connect with, the missions that we serve, and the vision we have for a stronger, more socially oriented future where inclusive prosperity is really at the forefront. And so I think it would just, the last thing I would leave you with is just prioritization that in the design, is to make sure that we always keep that in full view. And as we build out our ecosystem, and that journey that Josh spoke about, that we're always keeping the why really close to our hearts, and also close to how we do things. Yeah, that would be it for me.
Yeah, that's great. A great reminder, Chelsea, that, we're trying to tackle a lot of different issues, even just within folks on this panel today, from food security to climate change, to housing and homelessness, centering that why in the way that we develop policy and the way that we implement it is so critical. So folks, this brings us to the end of this panel and the end of this conference. Caroline, will I pass it over to you for final thank yous, or do you want me to?
You can do it.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank all of you folks for coming out, for spending at least a full day with us. For some of you, it's been really 2 full days. It's been such a pleasure being physically in a space with so many brilliant people and sharing so many brilliant ideas, so I thank you for that. I also want to thank Mariana, who has been the brains behind this operation and has done such a brilliant job. I want to thank the fine folks at CITL who have been managing some tech ups and downs over the past couple of days, but doing a brilliant job as per usual, so thank you so much. And also I want to thank our interpreters, who I think it was, somebody said it earlier, but incredible work. And finally, I want to thank the members of the coalition who have been dedicating lots of hours, time, thought over the past couple of years to thinking through what social procurement, social finance, and social innovation could look like in Newfoundland and Labrador. Folks doing this certainly off the sides of their desks, but with a lot of passion and energy and hard work. So thank you to those on this panel and those who couldn't be with us today as well. Yay. So in terms of next steps, we are hoping to do a bit of a summary of some of the key ideas shared over the last few days, and certainly we have your email, so we'll be sharing that back with you. As has been alluded to, we are continuing to try to figure out what membership within the Social Innovation Coalition looks like. But for now, if you are interested in being involved, I'll volunteer Mariana. Please get in touch with Mariana to share that you're interested, and we'll be sure to loop you in. And I think with that, we'll let you folks all go. I think there's some refreshments. Yes, some refreshments in the lobby if you'd like to stick around for a few minutes and have a final little chat. But otherwise, thank you folks so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.